human being is the most successful mammal on Earth. But where did we come from? 6 million years ago, our earliest ancestors stood up and began to walk on 2 legs. But why did we evolve differently to the other apes? And how did we become the first conscious animal on the planet? That's where the arguments begin. Conventional wisdom states that as Africa grew hotter and drier, apes and humans parted company. But there's also a far more controversial idea. Maybe we evolved to walk at the water's edge, with the instinct to swim, hold our breath underwater, and fish. This so-called aquatic ape theory could even explain why we grew such large brains. So, were we all once water babies? Ever since the first fossils of our ancestors were unearthed, anthropologists like Professor Leslie Aiello have been trying to shed light on the mystery of our origins.
We're trying to ask questions of the fossils, we're trying to ask questions of the sites, we're trying to ask questions of the paleoenvironmental evidence to piece together what type of an environment it was these early ancestors lived in.
The question is, did these early ancestors live by the waterside? The aquatic ape theory first surfaced in the 1970s with the publication of a book by Elaine Morgan. It proved to be an instant hit. Elaine had been inspired by the ideas of eminent zoologist Sir Alister Hardy.
Alister Hardy had a different theory about why we are so different from the apes. Why we walk on 2 legs, why we have a layer of fat, why we lost our hair, and even why we can speak. And he thought that we might have gone through a period of being semi-aquatic and adapting to water.
Amid the dreaming spires of Oxford, Dr. David Horrobin was also intrigued by Hardy's ideas.
Well, I was running the science club at Balliol College in Oxford, and Alister Hardy published his article in the New Scientist. And so I went round to see him and asked if he would come and give us a talk in Balliol about the aquatic ape theory. And as far as I'm aware, that's the first and perhaps the only time he's actually lectured in public about the aquatic ape theory. And it was a wonderful occasion because he really was wildly enthusiastic about this and presented it in a way which I found at the time totally convincing.
It wouldn't surprise me if among the primates, one stock was forced by competition to feed along the shore and go further and further out and learning to stand up in the water and picking things up or going down, picking them up and feeding up above water. He'd be continually doing this. And so he gradually learnt to get the erect posture, just as the monkeys have done in Japan. And so he would learn to walk on the shore.
However, the fossil hunters of the time felt that Hardy's theory didn't stand up to scrutiny.
Ever since Sir Alister Hardy put it forward in 1960, it has been scorned, derided, made fun of. Nobody has really taken it seriously. You either burst into guffaws of uncontrollable laughter or you tapped your head about in respect of the person speaking it. It's a little baby baboon.
One of the most eminent paleontologists in the field, Professor Philip Tobias, has been excavating African fossils for over 50 years.
And it's baboon.
Along with everyone else, he's derided the aquatic ape theory, but now he's reconsidering.
I plead, and this is the part that I have tried to play for the last 3 years, for the hypothesis to be given a square deal, fair consideration.
The idea that at some time in human evolution, we spent a lot of time by the water, and that influenced the way our behavior, our physiological functioning, and our brains work. That, I think, is going to become part of mainstream.
Charles Darwin's theory that our ancestors split from the great apes in Africa is backed up by the fossil record. But why did this split happen? It's believed that around 6 million years ago, Africa became hotter and drier. Conventional theories suggest that this change forced our ancestors to become bipeds. Standing upright on 2 legs, we strode out across the hot, dry savannas, while the ancestors of modern-day chimpanzees stayed in the trees. This theory is known as the savanna theory of human evolution, and it's under attack.
I am convinced that we first went into the water and began to get adapted to it at the time when we split for the apes, because I think it is the thing which explains most of the differences.
But Professor Peter Wheeler thinks the traditional theory of evolution isn't about to be washed away.
Certain key differences between humans and apes, for example, are bipedal posture, the loss of body hair, the increase in body size and the acquisition of a taller, thinner, what we call a more linear physique, all would have conferred significant benefits in more open equatorial environments. The advantage of bipedalism is threefold. You gain less heat from the sun, you produce less heat internally in the muscles, and you're able to lose this heat more easily to the surrounding environment. And when you put all those together, what you find is an animal able to stay out in these environments longer, engage in much more active activities, and also it's able to do that while expending less water.
In terms of keeping cool, if you were living by a river, well then you can't be going for a dip to keep cool. I mean, that to me would seem the obvious way of keeping cool.
However, the savanna theory faces growing opposition. Rather than walking tall on the hot savanna, our ancestors were actually still living deep in the forest.
I think what's happening is that we're realizing that our earliest ancestors didn't necessarily live in open savannas. And this has left the door open again for the aquatic ape hypothesis.
The old idea that savanna triggered bipedalism is no longer tenable. Open the window, I said, and fling it out. The savanna hypothesis is dead. So we're back to square one. The aquatic ape hypothesis lists in recent times the uprightness as a consequence of spending a lot of time in the water to keep your head above the water. If you were a quadruped going on all fours like that, your head would be below the water and it wouldn't be compatible with life. And so one of the features that some of the upholders of the aquatic ape theory believe resulted from water emphasis was the uprightness.
Algis Koulioukas strongly supports this idea.
My particular thesis has got 3 strands to it. One looking at extant apes to find as much information and evidence I can that shows that extant apes do wade bipedally in water. I think there's quite convincing evidence for that. Secondly, with human subjects, I want to go to a place like this and see humans in shallow water and actually see what kind of depth of water is wading more efficient than swimming. And then try to hypothesize about a kind of environment where that kind of depth of water would be at a premium. So for instance, swamps or seaside, lakeside, or maybe even rivers, to get a feel for that kind of environment where wading would actually be the best locomotion.
In terms of the comparative anatomy, those early first bipedal ancestors have very much in common with modern chimpanzees that are our closest living relatives. Many parts of the skeleton are very similar, indicating that they engaged in a climbing type of adaptation. But they were bipedal, walked on 2 feet when they were on the ground. But there's nothing whatsoever to link this bipedalism with a development in an aquatic environment.
The war of words looks set to rage on. The problem is, it's impossible to prove what really made us develop a two-legged gait. The patchy fossil record can't tell us whether these animals lived in water, but why rely on fossils when there are living clues for us to examine? Perhaps the answer is to compare ourselves with our closest cousin in the natural world, the chimpanzee. Professor Vernon Reynolds has been studying chimpanzees in the wild for nearly 40 years.
Oh, I was very interested in a human who wasn't quite a human, I think. I was a young man in those days. When I first started, I started studying chimpanzees in 1962. My wife and I went out to Uganda, to the same place where I go now. Been doing it all my life. We're 5 million years or so away from the chimp, which means about 5 million years ago there was an ancestral form living in Africa. It actually looked much more like a chimp than like a human, but it was the common ancestor of both. In terms of genetics, we're very, very close to the chimpanzee indeed. In fact, we're closer to the chimpanzee than any other species. If you look at a human and you look at a chimp, you'd say they were miles apart. They just don't look similar. But in actual fact, they are very similar genetically, and genetics is really what counts when you're looking at relationships. If two species have the same genes, they are closely related in their evolution.
One of the things that differentiates us from chimpanzees is our ability to swim, and above all, hold our breath underwater. From the day we're born, we possess this diving reflex and we never lose it. But if we didn't evolve in or near water, why on earth did we develop this reflex?
We have voluntary control of breathing, but how that control of breathing evolved and what it's for is an open question. It may have evolved for going into water quite recently. It may have evolved for controlling vocalization and speech. We don't really know why it first occurred. It's very useful in diving, but that's not necessarily why it first appeared.
There may also be other explanations for the diving reflex, and what it takes is somebody to look into it in detail, research what the reasons for the diving reflex actually are, and only then can we begin to test the hypothesis that this may have developed in an aquatic environment.
It's not just in babies, we all have the diving reflex, and I think, again, it must be that we've evolved this habit through selection at a time when we were in the water.
So is our ability to swim and hold our breath unique among primates? Unlike humans, chimpanzees are reluctant waders, but what are they like as swimmers?
Chimps are very scared of water. Chimpanzees hate any kind of depth of water.
Why is that?
Well, because they drown. As soon as the head goes into the water, they panic and drown. And I have myself pulled a chimpanzee out of a moat. There was a captive chimp, fell into a moat, and, well, I was amazed. I watched it happen. I thought, you're a silly chimp going near the water, and it slipped in and fell in. It was an adolescent female. And it went in, and there were a few bubbles, and that was it. You know, the water was still. There wasn't even much thrashing about.
While chimpanzees have a fear of water, we humans seem to revel in it. Yet another argument in support of the aquatic theory. But water isn't just for swimming. As humans need to drink more than any savanna living animal, we must have evolved near fresh water.
The other thing which makes physiological sense is that we are an animal which absolutely requires huge amounts of water. Our kidneys don't work all that well, And so at all times during our evolution, we must have had access to large amounts of water.
A thirst for drinking water and our inbuilt diving reflex are powerful points in favour of the aquatic theory. But it's impossible to date them, and they may both have evolved very recently. Kidneys and the diving reflex do not survive in the archaeological record. So what is still missing in support of the aquatic idea is some solid evidence linking our ancestors to water. To do that, we have to take another look at the fossils. The skulls of our ancestors are preserved in the fossil record. Pieced together, they tell the incredible story of the one thing that ultimately made us unique, our brain. Recent discoveries show that water played a crucial role in this vital evolutionary period. Once our ancestors had made the dramatic move to 2 legs 6 million years ago, it seems evolution paused to catch its breath. Then, around 2.5 million years ago, simple tools start appearing in the fossil record and brain size begins to increase. Over the next 2.5 million years, brain size continues to grow. But the final massive leap occurs relatively recently, just over 100,000 years ago. Today, we have a brain that's 3 times the size it should theoretically be.
There's a very strong relationship between brain size and body weight throughout all mammals. But modern people are exceptional in the extent to which they've been able to support a very large brain size, much larger than you would predict from their body weight. And archaic hominids were not as developed in that respect as we are. So we really need an explanation as to why modern people have such large brains in relation to their body weight.
The question is, how did we manage to grow such huge brains?
If we were to grow our brains, as we clearly did, then we must have had access to water-based food. Our brains need the sorts of fatty acids which are found in water-living animals.
Unlike humans, chimpanzees don't eat fish, and their brains are over 60% smaller than ours. Is this further proof that humans led a more aquatic lifestyle in their past?
It may be important, but the question is when we started to eat fish. And until there's evidence that these earliest ancestors were eating fish, all we can do is speculate.
Nevertheless, to build our huge brains, we needed chemicals known as long-chain fatty acids.
About 1/3, i.e. 20% of the total weight of the brain, is made up of these key fatty acids which ultimately come from the water food chain.
But mainstream scientists oppose the aquatic supporters as to where these key nutrients came from.
These nutrients would have included bone marrow, the spinal cord, and the brain itself, which of course is the richest source of these particular fatty acids. So we don't have to invoke aquatic foods or an aquatic environment to show how our ancestors got these fatty acids, because we could synthesize them ourselves and get them from alternate sources.
I don't think we need to go out and kill lions and things in order to get the fatty acids we needed for the brain. We could do it by gathering all these small creatures which happen to live by the waterside.
There are plenty of people today who grow up quite normally with normal brain development who never eat fish in their life. I certainly didn't eat fish until I was in my 20s, and I would hope that I've got a fairly normal-sized adult brain.
No doubt that's true, but while we hunt for clues as to whether our brain food came from flesh or fish, recent evidence states that fish is still good for the brain.
There's very interesting recent work from National Institutes of Health in the USA showing that within the USA, people who don't eat fish have much more depression than people who do eat fish. So even within a Western population inside a single country, there is now good modern evidence that eating fish affects the brain. The chemicals which we need for our brain are actually made by microalgae, And these microalgae produce these chemicals. They're then eaten by bigger animals and birds and so on. And what that means is that all the creatures in the aquatic food chain have these fatty acids in them.
According to this idea, our fish-eating habits started around 3 million years ago, just when our brains began to grow. But is there any evidence for this?
At this early time period, there's no tangible evidence in the archaeological sites that our early ancestors were exploiting aquatic resources.
In fact, it's another 2.5 million years before any firm evidence comes to light, and by then we're fully modern humans. At archaeological sites in South Africa, John Parkington has found overwhelming evidence linking the earliest modern human remains to large deposits of shellfish known as middens.
We're about 100 kilometres north of Cape Town on the Atlantic coast of the Cape. I think we are looking at the remains of a small shelter in which people sheltered whilst they consumed shellfish, other marine foods and terrestrial foods that they were gathering in the vicinity of this place. Some of the earliest shell middens that we know of anywhere in the world come from this part of southwest Africa, and also in and associated with some of those shellfish are some of the earliest modern human remains. It looks as though the Cape here was certainly part of the area in which anatomically modern people evolved. People whose cranial remains would have been indistinguishable from ours. Skeletally, they were like us. What this implies is that all people are descended from these populations. And if those populations are Africans, which they appear to have been, then in a sense we're all Africans.
These earliest humans certainly had a taste for fish, but that wouldn't be enough to give them bigger brains.
If you take these fatty acids and feed them to a rat or a mouse or a human, you don't just get a bigger brain by feeding the fatty acids. You have to have a mechanism for getting the fatty acids from the food into the brain.
The conventional view has been that when people became modern, they started to collect shellfish and leave them in nice heaps. But it seems to me that it might have been the other way around, that in fact it was the collection of these marine foods that allowed them to get bigger brains and become modern.
Neuroscientists like David Horobin support Parkington's idea. All he needs now is proof. Genetic mutation must have triggered a mechanism to transport the fatty acids from fish into our brains. David Horobin thinks he's found this crucial gene in a surprising place.
Initially, the schizophrenia research was nothing to do with this at all, but it was only as we unraveled the biochemistry of schizophrenia that we began to realize how closely involved it was with these water-based fatty acids. And then WHO did a very large study on schizophrenia which said, my God, this is a very strange disease. This is the only disease we know of which is found to exactly the same degree in all the races, and therefore must have been present before the races separated. And that began to ring bells, because that's a pretty profound observation.
If schizophrenia has always been with us, some of John Parkington's earliest humans must have suffered from it. David Horobin believes the gene for schizophrenia is also the gene which made us intelligent.
What we've been able to show from our own research is that these fatty acid metabolizing enzymes play an absolutely critical role in the development of schizophrenia. If you are schizophrenic, there will be many other members of your family who are very clever. Einstein's son was schizophrenic. Lots of Bertrand Russell's family was schizophrenic. James Joyce's daughter was schizophrenic. And the children of at least 5 recent biomedical science Nobel Prize winners are schizophrenic. So I personally think that the development of the genetic basis of schizophrenia, which brought schizophrenia into humanity, is actually also what made us human.
But this theory's opponents aren't so sure.
Everyone wants our ancestry to be special in some ways, and the aquatic ape provides that yearning for a special ancestry. But unfortunately, when you dig beneath the surfaces of many of these correlations, they just simply don't hold up.
Until there is actual evidence to support a serious aquatic involvement, I don't think that we're going to be able to say that that's at all a contender for a theory for human evolution.
I think absolutely it is going to be increasingly recognized that a water phase of our existence played a major role in evolution.
If we were living on the savannah, we would have been the most profligate urinators in the whole of Africa.
We've always needed lots of drinking water. We still settle near fresh water, and fish remains the best brain food. But until many more relics of human prehistory are unearthed, no one will be able to provide the final answer. Still, radical ideas like the aquatic ape theory encourage the ebb and flow of argument. They draw us ever nearer to the truth about the very beginnings of human life on Earth.